Thanks, George. And before I share my slides, I want to say hello to everyone. I see lots of familiar faces here, so it's good to connect with you. The other thing I want to say before I get started, I know, as I get to know heads, board chairs, trustees, I know we have a few division heads participating today. Everyone that's involved in the independent school enterprise really wants the best for students. And so I think, all of these meltdowns that I'm going to talk about today, are certainly happen while we're in the process of trying to make the best decisions for our school and the students that we serve. So, none of this, everyone comes at this with the best of all intentions. So I hope what we can collectively talk about today is some of the reasons that when you get down to the root cause, that cause things to go awry, and how we might look at those as we build leadership teams, as we build boards, because I think there are some ways that we can ensure that there is less opportunity for these kinds of things to happen. So I just wanted to start with that, because I think sometimes when we talk about meltdowns, we actually think of them as really focusing on people. And a very smart person about 20 years ago said to me, the research shows that when things go awry, usually when you look at the root causes, 1% is actually people and 99% are processes. So that's what we're really going to talk about today, is how we can look at these meltdowns through a different lens. So I'm going to share my screen, and here we go. So we will be off and running, and one of the things, whether this actually excites you to no end or terrifies you, for those of you who have your cell phones or access to a computer, we're going to try a little bit of online polling. If it doesn't work, that's fine, but in the event that it's something that you would like to try your hands at, it's a fun way to get a sense of where the group is. So you can make your own decision, and I will walk you through it very carefully. So sorry about this. I'm going to stop this share and launch it again, because there we go. Didn't want to move forward. I think in the last 10 years, there have been a lot of news stories that we have all have read about and have been overanalyzed, from the Penn State board meltdown to the University of Virginia, to, in our world, a lot recently around the Hershey School. And from the perspective, I think, of schools and students, what's very bad about this, when it gets to this level, it can have many unintended consequences. And these are some that I observed. Obviously, in many cases, someone may get fired. Yet in other cases that I have been part of discussing with schools, there are people who you would hope would not leave the school who have resigned because of the particular issue. It can erode trust. That's probably the hardest thing to rebuild when we have some sort of an issue within a school community. Can also affect school enrollment and the financial sustainability of the school moving forward. And in some of the worst cases, we end up in the courts. And that can be very difficult on the people, the schools, and the future growth and development. So I think anything that we can do to really ensure that we are operating, whether it's a leadership team, whether it's a head and the board working together, or whether it's a board by itself, that we are firing on all pistons and are doing the best job that we can. So just to start thinking about where you are, we are going to actually start with a little poll. And I've actually started us rolling with some words. And what I would love to know from you, and depending upon what your role, you can think about this as your board, you can think about it as your leadership team. But what word would you use to describe your board or your leadership team when it's at its best? And I've started this off. It could be, you know, when you're at your best, you're a team. You really work as a team. You may be aligned. So if you'd like to participate and you have your cell phone available, this is what you do. You're going to text to the number 22333. In the body of the text, all is one word, you're going to type Donna Orem 631. Once you've done that, your phone should actually accept it, and you will be able to type in any word that you'd like. And what I would love to do is to build a little bit of a word cloud here. And so if you're with me and you want to play along, we will get a sense of the group before we get started. There's a good one, non-intrusive. Synergy, oh, I love that word. Task, very task-oriented. All right, well, I think you have the hang of it. We'll let this go for a few more minutes. For those of you who are really familiar with word clouds, you know that the more people who type in one word, the bigger the word gets. So supportive is in the lead right now. Oh, respectful. All right, well, we'll keep on capturing those, but we're going to move on, and I think you know what's coming is the opposite of that. If you start to think about what happens when the board is at its worst. I put on some words here. I think the mission aligned just probably creeped in as I was changing slides, so I'll make sure to move that back. But you know, fractured is certainly a big one. We are not operating as one unit. Reactionary is one that we often hear, and I'm going to talk about a few case studies of that, because I think in some of the areas where we've seen meltdown, I think well-intentioned people working together in a crisis can be reactionary for a number of reasons. Boundaries, that's a good one. You know, when do we cross boundaries? Rigid. We'll let a few more of these load. This is fun, isn't it? I think fractured and reactionary are definitely taking the lead here in terms of when we are operating not at our best. Meddling. Intrusive. We'll let a few more go. All right, well, thank you for that. I'll capture these, and actually when I send the PowerPoint out, you can keep these, so you can, it may be a nice follow-up conversation with your board or leadership team to actually have a similar conversation. But there's some great ones here. So now what I'd like to get into, I'm going to talk about 4 different scenarios and tell you some stories of what we have seen in the last few years that have really contributed to meltdowns. And you know, the first one is one that happens quite often, and the symptom is that there's some kind of a disagreement between the head and the board over some sort of issue. And I'll tell you a case of how this often plays out. And you may have a particular set of circumstances. Let's say you are hiring a new head of school. And there may be a number of things that the board, in doing an assessment of where the school is, identifies that perhaps there's no long-term financial planning for the school. There's been a decline in enrollment. There may be issues with satisfaction with the parents. And so when the board takes very seriously hiring a new head of school, the first thing they may say is, we want someone who is a change agent. We really need to get the school on a different path, and we very much want somebody to come in to really look at the existing landscape and to make appropriate changes. So that's a case that we hear over and over and over again. And obviously that's a good goal, because the work of the Board of Trustees is to really ensure the long-term health of the school. So they've done their due diligence in looking at the issues that the school is facing and saying, we need a new head to come in and make those changes. But in a number of cases, what happens is 2 to 3 years later, things do not go as everyone hoped they would, and the head of school is fired. So what happened in this particular case? Well, again, we're going to actually dig into this after I go through 3 more scenarios, but some of the things that we've seen is a misalignment on goals. In some cases, there hasn't been really an articulation of what specifically the head's goals are or how the head is going to carry them out. Another one that we see is that there's no agreement upon what success looks like. So, if this is what I'm going to do, this is my big, hairy, audacious goal, how do we agree that success will be reached? What are those metrics of success? Another aspect of this that we often see is there aren't opportunities for the head at regular board meetings or with meetings with perhaps a smaller group to report out on progress toward meeting goals. And this can be really crucially important, because often, what is said on paper and print and what's interpreted in our heads can be quite different. So, I think an opportunity for the head to really say, here's how I am enacting those goals, and this is what I'm encountering so far, allows for there to be an opportunity for any kind of course correction where, the board and the head perhaps may not see it in the same way. Another thing that contributes to this is communication that's broken down, and certainly between heads and boards, that agreement that there will be no surprises, that we keep good communication is also at the core of this. The other thing is that if we haven't had a chance to really establish trust between the head and the board and other members of the school community, and the board itself. And I'll talk a little bit more about some symptoms of that and how we might address it. The second thing, which I think maybe some of you on the telephone have certainly experienced this year, a number of case studies have been around risk management issues. And one that's really certainly emerged for so many schools are educator sexual misconduct. And I think for those schools who were at the very early stages of this, there was a lot of learning as they were going along. Whereas I think today there is much more good information about prevention and response. And I'll talk a little bit about that, as I think many of you know, NAIS and the Association of Boarding Schools has been working for the last year and a half with a task force to really try to get out into the community a report that talks about ways that schools can be prepared and ensure that they deal with this in a way that makes a lot of sense. And in terms of case studies in this area, I have seen this play out in a number of ways. Number one is within your own community. if you don't dot your I's and cross all of your T's with all members of your community well. There have been cases where the alumni is very upset. There is a case right now, as a matter of fact, where a group of very prominent alumni, it's actually not a school that's on the call today, have banded together and have just launched a website to really force the school to deal with these issues in a very, very different way. So, and they just feel that although the school dealt well with other aspects of this, that they did not deal well or thoroughly with the alumni community. So, and this is actually how it's playing out. In another case, quite the opposite happened. There was an issue that in looking at potential sexual misconduct in the past, the board decided that there was a way that they felt that the head had not dealt well with this issue and fired the head and decided to open a probe into everyone that worked at the school. And it actually ended up spiraling down in a way that was very harmful to the community. They ended up losing enrollment. Quite a few administrators and faculty left the school. And, it's back on track right now, but there were a lot of unintended consequences over something where the board had the best intentions to try to ensure that the school was in the best possible place. And what were some of the major issues there is there was no overall risk management plan. And I think that this is a big issue for schools, is that there is not necessarily someone who is in charge of risk management across the board and is really thinking through it as an integrated plan. Another one that really emerged, I think, in these particular scenarios was not a detailed plan for dealing with crises. And I think, for most of the schools probably represented on the phone today, you have crisis management plans, but I think particularly in dealing with a lot of these issues around educator sexual misconduct, we found out a lot of other things, and it really pays to actually have such a detailed plan put in place beforehand, because if you actually have that plan and you've done some scenario planning, chances are this is not going to play out in a negative way. The other thing I think that sometimes happens is, and I think this is human nature, there may be some scapegoating, which is, we tend to, in crisis situations, can point fingers, and that has had very, very negative effects as well. So, if we actually have, this is a case, I think, where we have policies and plans in place well ahead, and have actually, as a board or a leadership team, done some scenario planning, we are at our best when these kinds of situations come upon us, because they will. It may not play out in educator sexual misconduct, but it may play out in another kind of crisis. So I think, the key, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, is how we think about policies and plans and how we put them into place. The third case where we have seen a lot of meltdowns this year is, in the NAIS membership, probably about 40% of our schools are experiencing some kind of decline in enrollment. In some cases, that has been small, and in other cases, it has been quite alarming. And the board and the leadership team working together is concerned about the financial stability of the school, rightfully so, moving forward. Now, this seems to be one that all of the parties are aligned on what should happen. It would seem like one of the least likely scenarios in which there would be a meltdown. But, in fact, we have seen a number of cases recently where there have been governance and leadership meltdowns around this particular issue. And it usually results in, the board often hiring someone who they feel has the knowledge and skill to really examine this situation and develop strategies to move it forward. But a few things have happened in this particular case that has contributed to it not going well. And a big one is not having data to really inform the context of the school. And that can lead to unreal expectations of what is possible. And what I will talk about in terms of this particular case is how important not only being data informed and how to really build that into your DNA, but also to really have joint goal setting between the head and the board about what this looks like. This is another area where it's really helpful to be very clear about what great looks like in this particular situation. And where I've often seen this going wrong is boards as a whole not taking the time for the professional development that would really educate them about the context in which the school finds itself, so that there is a complete understanding of what might be possible, where to support budgetarily new initiatives, where to make cuts in the budget. You know, this is a tough area and there aren't necessarily any silver bullets. So the more data that can be put into context, the more that context can be turned into business intelligence for the school, the more the head and the board and the entire school leadership team are working together and aligned on strategy, the more effective. You know, and I think a really tricky piece of this is, I think as human beings, we tend to be really hardwired about solving problems. And something that I have been doing a lot of exploration into recently, I'm going to end talking about this, is the whole world of polarity management, which I think is really a great tool for leaders to have in their toolkit. And the School of Polarity Management, what it really teaches us is that there are a lot of things that we are dealing with that are not problems to be solved, but rather they are polarities to be managed. And I think, you know, often when we think about declining enrollment for a school, you know, what the polarity, how it often plays itself out is what is really the core of this school? What is its vision? Is one pole in a polarity, and the other is what the market is interested in today. And the School of Polarity Management says that these are not opposing things, they are part of one system. And so, you know, even if we are really predisposed to try to find solutions, in many cases it's so complicated, it's actually not a problem to solve, it's a polarity to manage. And you know, that means more active education, more active data collection coming in so that we are, as the leaders for the school community, constantly looking in our situation in light of a changing set of facts. So at the end, I'm going to give you a little bit more of a brief overview of how a leadership team or a board might change the way they function, really based around the tools of polarity management. Finally, another case that I see all the time are factions on the board. And this might play itself out this way. I'll tell you a story. I actually served on this school board that had no term limits. And so there were a very long-standing group of trustees on the board who were very committed to the school. And there was a very strong executive committee. And they became so strong over time that they were making very, very strong decisions. And the board, because the rest of the board members tended to be mostly newer board members, were rubber stamping, and in some cases were afraid to ask questions. So it ended up with one or two players really putting forth what they thought was in the best interest of the school. And again, I think this was done in what, being longstanding members of the community, they thought was in the best interest, but it ended up eroding trust on the board. There were factions, and it brought the board into a huge conflict. So, one of the things that we constantly have to guard against is how do we build trust in the board so that we understand that, during times of trouble and times of crisis, often, we are not our best selves. I mean, we can move to anger or conflict. And what are the underlying structures that would ensure that a board or a leadership team is at its best? And, for the board, certainly examining things like term limits. If we find that, and this often happens, and I'm sure most of you have experienced this one time or another, the meeting after the meeting, when there is a meeting when you're discussing an issue, and for whatever reason, people are not completely honest at the table, and we have factions that break off afterwards, and it really creates splintering on the board. And again, it can have some of the negative outcomes that I just spoke about. So these are 4 of the cases that I think we see the most at NAIS when either a head of school or a board chair, or in some cases a parent who is very upset about what's happening in the community, may contact us and say, here is the scenario. Although there are many more, and I think within your school communities, you've faced some individually, but I'm going to base what I'm going to say moving forward on these 4 scenarios. And what I'm going to be using to talk about this, and many of you may have seen this, but the organization Board Source does a study every year on the state of nonprofit governance. And it usually typically goes through attributes, but this year they did something different. They released a report called Leading with Intent that really looked at a lot of correlations between attributes of boards and how it actually plays out in board performance, board head relationships, the overall sustainability of the organization. And those correlations, I think, give us some food for thought about some things that we might think about moving forward. Because in my analysis, and usually when we are involved in talking to a head or a board chair or a group of trustees about a situation that has happened, it's somewhat like a plane crash. It's not any one thing. It tends to be when you start to dig down into doing some root cause analysis, it may be 3 or 4 of all of these things listed. It may be the way the board is made up, how the trustees are appointed. It may be how intentional a board is about establishing a certain culture. It may be because there isn't as clear understanding of roles as there should be. And there may be transparency and clarity lacking between the head and the board. Or there is no practice of assessing performance to understand where some of the sore spots are. So in all of these meltdowns, it can be one or many of these. And I'm going to now spend a little bit of time talking about some of the things that Board Source found when they started to actually look at some of these attributes together. The first is, it's very hard, I think, these days to build a board. We are all busy people, and often usually trustees have full-time jobs. So really finding people who have the time to devote to this enterprise can be hard to begin with. But it's even harder to find the right people and to then cultivate them and keep them engaged in the board. And, one of the things that Board Source found is that we probably do not give enough time to this. We do not spend enough time doing succession planning so that we are thinking 3, 4, and 5 years out. And, so I think an important conversation to have, and to have the governance committee or the committee on trustees, whatever you may call it, is to really talk about strategic recruitment. And what they suggest is that we need to be narrow and more focused about what we're looking for, and also to really work at cultivating talent, to spread that net very far. One of the things that I often hear, particularly from day schools, is that, we really have to have people who can drive into our board meeting. And so, we have a very small net that we can throw. And I would push back on that, because I think in this day of technology, we're all communicating via Zoom. It's probably more important to get the right trustees than the trustees who can attend every meeting in person. So doing this in a way, succession planning is really so important, is to really think long-term about what are the vision and mission of the school, and what kind of trustees do we need to move that forward. Hand in glove with that is diversity. And, there has been a ton of research on this, particularly recently, that for any group that is too homogenous is just going to have a lot of blind spots. And it's these blind spots that can sometimes lead to meltdowns. And, and one of the things that BoardSource really came out is that, in fact, board diversity across the nonprofit sector is not improving at all in terms of board diversity. And this just gives you a sense of throughout the nonprofit community, which is some education groups, other kinds of nonprofit groups. But we don't have that much diversity in any way. And this really just looks at race, ethnicity, gender, and age. But also diversity doesn't look at socioeconomic diversity. It doesn't look at diversity of thought. So the more diversity we have, the less likely we are to get hung up on those blind spots. Now, an interesting thing that BoardSource found when they did this study, and I'm going to actually show you this in a few minutes, but they had actually boards rate themselves. They had both the chief executive, in our case, the head of school, and the board chair rate the board in how well they do in a number of areas. And pretty much across the board, one of the lowest ratings was in board diversity. But yet, when they asked boards how many had it as a goal to actually really actively change that, it was a very small number. And the point is that if we are not setting board goals around things that affect our performance, they are never going to change. So actually looking at this and calling it out for your board or leadership team is important. Also, I talked about term limits, and I have been on many boards where there are incredibly strong trustees that have served for a very long time, and particularly during times of transition, these can be incredibly important players. And so, there is a lot of question of, really, should we have term limits as part of our bylaws? Because, if you have strong members, don't you want them around? Don't you want the history of the institution represented? And I think yes and no. Obviously you can have that, but most of the research would say bringing on new talent is really important to the long-term health of the school. So, and what you can often find is in your bylaws, you can set term limits, but you can write them in such a way for a situation for someone to stay on past a term given a certain set of circumstances, which gives you the leeway should you have a difficult time that you feel that that kind of consistency is important, you can continue to have it. But probably the biggest player in all of this is board culture. and how you really are very intentional about what the board's culture is and how you look at that. And I think that actually starts with calling out a list like this and having this kind of assessment with your board. In this particular case, in this survey, you can see that there are a lot of board culture characteristics that BoardSource looked at and then asked really how well both the chief executive and the chair felt about how well they performed. And one of the lowest, which I think they found out is a real problem, is our board has an annual retreat with getting to know you and bonding exercises. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later on, but it's actually these kinds of things that end up creating the trust that is going to be the bedrock of both a leadership team and a board when you're in a tough situation. Trust is like money in the bank. When you fall on hard times, you can count on that in ways to, take bold decisions, move in different directions. So this is probably a good exercise for any board to take, is with your head. And when you have these slides, you can just go ahead and copy them and just have your board agree on how well you think you do in all of these areas, because it can start to point out some of the areas that you in your particular leadership team or board may want to work on. What are the things that you do really well and probably don't need a lot of emphasis going forward, and what are some of the ones that need some work? The other thing, and I think you certainly all know this, that actually one of the most important aspects to the culture of the board is the board chair. And I think this is the same, the head of a school often really establishes that culture for the school. So, these are very, very important roles in establishing culture. And there's been, and you can read the research in BoardSource, but, picking the right board chair with the right attributes, and there's been a lot of research on how important it is to have an emotionally intelligent leader, whether it be the head of school or the board chair, because that person really is key to building trust. They're really key to helping the board move through conflict into consensus, or in some cases, compromise. They're really key in establishing those clear expectations. So leading with intent in terms of making that choice can make or break a culture moving forward. And I talked a little bit about how one of the low culture attributes in all of the nonprofits that participated in Leading Intent was this role of social time. And so when they looked at it, one of the things that they really wanted to see was, for those boards that said that they were a really collaborative team, what percentage of them built in social time? And they found that that was pretty heavily correlated, that where the board was in the assessment of the chief executive and the board chair working well as a collaborative team, a greater percentage of them really took time to build in social activities so that that trust would be established. They also found that there was a correlation between boards that did that and the kind of engagement that trustees had and their willingness to serve the board through their terms. So, I often think that we see this as nice to have, and particularly with, I think, trustees who are really busy and you have so much work to do on behalf of the school, sometimes doing, just having a frivolous time together can seem like not a good use of your time, but in fact, it's actually one of the things that will ensure that you are building that bedrock of trust. So it was one of the real insights that actually came out of this piece of research that BoardSource did. You know, as I mentioned before too, is you know, they looked at across the board, these were the ratings that the various nonprofit organizations, whether it be the chief executive or the board chair, gave to themselves for various roles. And so, you know, a big question for those of you, whether you be on a leadership team or on a board, it's only worth doing this exercise if you're going to do something about it. So when you as a board, for example, for all you trustees on the call, if you do this kind of work, which I would say that it's crucial for you to do this kind of assessment, does it then link to your board goals? If you score poorly, do you actually set goals and performance measures to improve those? Because again, these are some of the key things that will ensure that you don't actually have some of these meltdowns. They may seem unrelated, but it's that bedrock foundation for boards with trust, who serves on the board, the kind of operations that you have that really keep you in hard times from going off the rails. So engaging in this kind of exercise, which is simple to do, can really provide some insight in terms of where you need work to do. You know, and the same is true in terms of, and a lot of you wrote this when your board was at their best, you used the word supportive. And so I think, you know, where I see that going poorly is when there really isn't very intentional work about the board and the head working together to agree upon the head's goals, the board establishing goals for themselves, both groups identifying what would be the performance metrics. What does success look like? Having time to really discuss it, whether it be giving the head time to report out or for the board to spend some really good time looking at their assessment and talking about how well they're doing on their goals, you know, crucially important. And Dick Chait actually has something very interesting to say about all of this too, is that, you know, we've been looking at kind of makeup, structure, and operations, but when he has examined a lot of things that have sent boards or leadership teams in the wrong direction, you know, he says a lot of it is not actually taking the time to really be very forthright about purpose. And that often what happens is we look at jobs very narrowly. But what, you know, a great conversation to have with your board is, how do we make board service more meaningful? You know, what is it that would make you feel like you are making a difference to this school? So, you know, the healthiest boards, the boards who have the healthiest culture, first of all, spend a lot of time talking about that. What kind of difference can they make? They lead with vision. So there's a vision for the school in addition to the mission. Who do we hope to be to the community? Who do we hope to be to the students we serve? 5 years from now, what would we like people to say about us? Those are the kinds of things that, again, are at the bedrock of healthy teams, whether it be the leadership team or the board. And finally, I think assessment really matters. One of the things, and board education really matters, is that those boards that really pause to educate and train themselves, not only about the school's programs, but about the context in which the school exists, actually just do better across the board. Leading with Intent really leaned into this. And they suggested that both board diversity and board education were two of the areas that most boards really needed to focus on. And so again, this may be a really interesting exercise for you to look at as well. And also as part of your assessment, to ask yourselves, do you self-manage? You know, we spend a lot of time looking at what it is to be emotionally intelligent as individuals, but actually, are we taking the time to assess whether we are emotionally intelligent groups? And if we were to ask ourselves these questions, which are around the area of self-management, how would we do? Do we actually encourage higher performance, and do we assess that? Do we ensure that we are setting aside time to do that? And do we share accountability, and what does that look like? Do we collectively take responsibility for failures as opposed to scapegoating? So taking the time and really then digging into this to say, if we are not operating in this way, how do we become more of an emotionally intelligent group? What are the things that we need to work on? And assessment is key. One of the interesting studies that they did as part of their report is they looked at the performance by how often the board assessed itself. And they found quite a lot of variance in these areas, because assessment by its very nature helps us to really identify where we're doing well and where we're doing poorly. And so obviously boards that assess themselves have that kind of information available so that they can set those performance goals, will ensure that they are performing at their very best. And even more importantly was understanding roles and responsibilities. And they again looked at the correlation between areas of board performance and how strong an understanding a trustee had of his or her role versus how weak. And you can see the variances on some of these. So again, this is really time from even before we bring somebody on a board or hire them to be part of a leadership team. Do they have a really clear understanding of that? And through assessments, are we sure of that? Do we actually test that out to make sure that we don't have to do some work to really shore that knowledge up? And as I mentioned, are we spending enough time really managing risk? Do you have an overall plan? These bullets that I have here are from the report that we're just about to release around educators' sexual misconduct. Because, if you are managing risk in that area, it means having such a well thought out plan from who at your school really owns student safety and protection. Is it a group of people? Have they been identified? Do you have proper policies in place? Is hiring and supervision centralized? Do you have a culture that allows reporting without retaliation? So on and so forth. But, having that level of a plan ensures that you're going to be at your best. So I'm going to pause here for one more poll. And, what I'd love to hear from you, I've talked about some challenges that boards face and some of the underlying root causes that we can shore up. So I would love to hear from you which of these areas, and obviously it's not everything that we've covered, but when you think about your board, what do you think is the biggest challenge? Do you have trouble identifying trustees? Do you have trouble recruiting them? Is culture elusive? Is it hard to focus on strategic priorities? So far, looks like board education and time to focus are taking recruitment also. I love watching these polls. It's a little like a horse race. If you've ever done that thing at the beach where it's the water gun race, I find that these really change over time. So again, we can start to see how this plays out. I hear from a lot of heads and board chairs that it has really been tough recruiting and retaining trustees, and it's something that NAIS is going to spend a lot of time on. And we are even toying with the idea of launching a trustee certification program and identifying people who could be great trustees, training them, and building a national database that you can you can actually draw from. The charter school movement has done this very successfully, and it's been very effective in bringing outside perspective to boards. So looks like everybody thinks they have a pretty healthy culture, so that's a good thing. But we'll let this go for a few more minutes. Oops, sorry about that. Nobody's worried about culture, huh? It looks like focus is, there's so much to do. And, I think that's like a great conversation for your board to have, is to figure out, as Dick Chait says, if you're not spending time on the main thing, how do you change that? What are things that you would take off your plate? So I know we're getting close. So I'm going to just go through a few closing thoughts. When I think about some of the meltdowns, there are 4 or 5 actions that I think that are really important for all of us to think about. Number one is, how do we build a board for mission? How do we think about that, and how do we make sure that we seek diversity in every way? We have representation of the past, present, and the future. I'm a big proponent of having a critical mass of outsiders on your board, because I think they can see things through a different lens, and really using committees and task forces to test out people before putting them on your board. Next is, I think, for all of us to embrace ethical leadership, and echoing the words of board sources, how do we be intentional about learning and really seeking the kind of input that we need to make the kind of ethical decisions that will put us in the right place. And often that means having that diversity of opinion to really inform decisions. And I think, back to the area of trust, embracing healthy conflict. Conflict is good and should be part of any kind of board or leadership team, but conflict and culture really go hand in hand, and building that trust is at the base of having healthy conflict. Because, what happens often in these situations when we have groups going against each other, you want people to be able to put their views forward, but be able to walk away if the consensus is to move in a different direction. And to be data informed and vision driven. And I can't say enough about this, because I think bringing data to the table and building it into the DNA of your practices is so important. And finally, embracing generative thinking. Again, I think as human beings, we are really hardwired, and it feels good to come up with solutions. But in fact, asking the bigger questions can lead us to much better conversations. And I'm a huge proponent of something called catalytic questioning. So if you have a tough issue, opposed to talking about the issue straight on, instead, for 20 minutes, just generating every question you have about that particular topic. And you will find that after about 10 minutes, some of the really interesting questions arise. And you frame the conversation. One of my favorite ways to do it is to frame it with the question that makes us the most uncomfortable, because chances are we're going to have the best conversation if we bring that elephant out and put it in the center of the board table. And finally, I mentioned polarity management. I think this is really an effective measurement. In fact, I spent the whole morning in a workshop with the Center for Creative Leadership on this. I very much suggest that you all read Barry Johnson's book on polarity management, because it will help you understand why there is so much conflict about some of these issues. Because what he says from the very beginning is that there are a lot of problems that are unsolvable. And we get angry and concerned because we're trying to have either or decisions, when in fact, They are just two poles that are part of the system. And he uses basically inhaling and exhaling as a metaphor that, we might prefer one over the other, but, we can't live without doing both. So I really suggest you look at that. And I'll close with this. At the very heart of this is your values should frame everything you do because they become your destiny. So that's all I have for today. And I hope some of this was helpful to you as you really think about building boards or leadership teams from the ground up that when times are tough are really equipped to deal with these particular scenarios, because I think, it's these root causes that are often at the bottom of some of the meltdowns that we have.